I'm going to give a talk today on some new work we're doing in Louisiana. This is with two of my colleagues, Nate Barrett and Jane Lincove, both who are with the Educational Research Alliance for New Orleans, which is based out of Tulane. So this work is interesting to me because I think we've been all following tenure policy for a while in California, and so I'll talk about that a little bit. But this is about what happens when a state wholesale gets rid of tenure, for the most part. Okay, so just a quick primer on teacher tenure policies for those of us who don't have it in our heads all the time. So tenure policies are intended, right? They're intended to actually make it harder to fire teachers. And they do this by dictating the amount of time that teachers can serve in, quote, probationary positions. This is before they have sort of the right to, this is when they still can get fired at will, right? And after that point in time, in California, it's a whopping 2 years. They can be dismissed only for just cause. Just cause, oftentimes, if you read the union contract or you read the state, depending on the state, or you read in California the state ledge, you'll see that just cause oftentimes is a very rigorous bar to reach, and it can often take quite a long time and cost quite a lot of money, which was part of the Vergara conversation that happened here in the last couple of years when you had all these superintendents testifying about how much time and money it actually took to let go of a teacher who already had achieved tenure. So proponents of tenure policies think that these are great laws, and they do that because they think that these laws were put into place for a reason, which is to protect teachers from unreasonable demands, from censure, and from arbitrary dismissals, from nepotism, things like that. And also because, and this is critical for our study, there's a belief that tenure laws can improve teacher recruitment and retention, and I'll get into that in a minute. Opponents of tenure argue that tenure actually can harm students in schools and districts because it makes it pretty hard to fire even an ineffective teacher who has tenure because of these resources that these superintendents were talking about in the Vergara trial. So, as I've been mentioning, teacher tenure has been a very hot topic in the media of late. Court cases like Vergara, like Wright in New York, there's been cases in Minnesota, in New Jersey, other states as well, have come to the courts where the plaintiffs have argued that actually having tenure laws in place enables ineffective teachers to continue teaching in schools, and this harms the low-income and oftentimes sort of disadvantaged schools the most because teachers sort of often can clump in those schools, and then those kids get most affected by these tenured teachers that are ineffective and hard to fire. There's been a lot of policy activity about tenure in the last few years. So before 2009, there was not a single state that had tenure legislation that required districts to take performance into account in making tenure decisions. But by 2016, 16 states actually mandated that tenure could not be granted without some sort of evidence of teaching effectiveness. 7 states had already enacted laws allowing districts to rescind tenure protections if the tenured teachers didn't meet performance standards. And 3 states had actually eliminated tenure and due process altogether. Public opinion, actually, I just was reading the EdNext on my way up here this morning, and I was just kind of looking through the poll, which happens every year, and they highlighted tenure as one of their areas of interest, and they were saying that only 31% of respondents in this year expressed a favorable view of giving tenure teachers and support, and that had declined by 10% since 2013 when they first asked the question. So public opinion about tenure for teachers is also declining in terms of their support. So why would we want to reform teacher tenure? This is kind of a very simplistic theory of action, right? So if you make tenure harder to obtain, so you make it so either it's longer in a probationary period, so 4 to 5 to 6 years to get tenure, or you take it away altogether, then administrators should be able to have more flexibility in managing their human capital, right? So administrators should be able to say, I'm going to have more time to assess the effectiveness and the potential of this teacher, and if I don't think this teacher is good enough, then I'm not going to give him or her tenure, and I can make the decision over an amount of time, or I never have to make the decision at all about a permanent, quote-unquote, job or due process necessity. So that can remove my not good teachers faster and better, and that can improve the quality of the teaching workforce in general. Again, very simplistic. But the problem is we're forgetting about some unintended consequences here, right? Teachers may view tenure as a very important part of their overall compensation, right? So teachers consider, from some work by Susanna and Marianne Page, we know, and other work that's followed on since, teachers consider both monetary and non-monetary benefits from their positions, right, as part of their overall compensation package. And these kinds of things can include job stability and the absence of employment risk, and there's a bunch of work that's come out to show that. And so when we remove tenure, we're effectively diminishing their compensation, right? We're diminishing their overall sort of value that they get from their job. And so we have to think about what that does to the recruitment of new teachers who are looking at basically lower compensation work, Or when we remove tenure for teachers who are already in place, they're basically seeing like a lowering of their overall compensation, and they may choose to leave the workforce for teachers. And we don't know a lot about this, right? So there's been actually, part of why is because we haven't seen until recently very much sort of movement in state policy about tenure. And so we haven't been able to do kind of the natural experiments that we would want to do in this room. But there have been some simulations that test the labor market implications impacts of diminished protections. So Steger and Rockoff have one, Rothstein have another. And both of these papers find that with some of these simulated data, that lessening tenure protections would cause gains in productivity. So it would kind of increase the productivity of the teacher labor market, teacher workforce in a district or a state, and kids would do better in school. But Rothstein takes it a step further and says, if we assume this about compensation for teachers, we should also model in what will happen to the teacher workforce in terms of quits. And he says that what he finds in his simulation is that by just denying tenure to more teachers or pushing out the probationary period by a year would require about a 30% increase in average teacher compensation. There's a little bit of empirical work on this. So Bruner and Mazecki have a piece in 2010 where they use the SAS data set and they use borders between states with different kind of probationary lengths of tenure, and they show that in fact, very similar teachers in similar locations across state borders with different tenure laws, those teachers with longer probationary periods do draw higher salaries than those similar teachers on the opposite side of the border. There's a paper that came out of New York recently from Susanna and colleagues that talks about teachers who had probationary time extended under a New York policy were likely to voluntarily exit if they had performance concerns. I know your name, but I can't remember. Chris, yes.
Do you have any evidence of people who more voluntarily quit? Like, are those high-performing teachers who would voluntarily quit, or is it low-performing? Because
yeah, my recollection from the New York paper, and so none of these papers do that, but the New York paper shows I think that lower performing teachers are more likely to quit if they're with the tenure extension.
So it's not necessarily bad.
No, and we'll get to that. Not at all. And that's kind of that original theory of action, right? That you're going to do this. But if you lose more teachers than just the bad ones, you need to think about that. OK, so we look at this in Louisiana, which is a natural experiment, right? They just did this in 2012, and we'll talk about the timeline. So we asked sort of a descriptive question first, which is, how do patterns in teacher attrition change in the 2 years after the removal of tenure protections in Louisiana? And then we say, OK, what's the actual impact of the removal of tenure protections on teachers who should be more or less affected by the policy change, right? This policy change went into place for all teachers in Louisiana, all public school teachers in traditional schools. So I don't have a comparison group, right? But there are teachers who theoretically should be more or less impacted by the removal of tenure, and we'll talk about those groups. So teachers who just lost versus never received tenure, and I'll kind of walk through that. Teachers who were eligible for full retirement at the time that the tenure was removed versus partially eligible for retirement or ineligible for retirement teachers, and traditional public school teachers versus charter school teachers. And charter school teachers never had tenure in Louisiana, whereas TPS teachers did.
Can you distinguish whether they left or no?
Nope. We cannot, and we also don't have any effectiveness measures yet, but we're getting them apparently this year. OK. So quickly, the tenure policy, the change in Louisiana, really reduced teachers' job security, right? And this is critical. So the pre-reform policy was teachers with less than 3 years or 3 years of experience were at-will employees. They could be fired at will for being ineffective, for showing up late, for whatever the principal decided. Once they're tenured in their 4th year, and it's the same thing that happens in California, you sort of get tenured pretty automatically in most districts in Louisiana in the pre-reform era. You could only be dismissed for approved reasons. And I have them written down because they are, this is very similar to other states. So dismissal required a hearing by the local school board at which the teacher must be found guilty of willful neglect of duty, incompetency, immorality, or being a member of a group that was legally prohibited from operating in the state. So those are the reasons that you could dismiss a teacher who had tenure. This resulted in very low dismissal rates for tenured teachers pre-reform. I mean, like 1%-ish, the same way that it is, that we can track, the same way that it is in most states that we can track. OK, so then what happened? Well, there was a whole set of teacher reforms in Louisiana. These are the two important ones. In 2010, the legislature passed Act 54. This is the evaluation reform. And what the legislature did is said, OK, you need to start developing a multiple measure evaluation system that's going to measure teacher performance based on half observations and half on some sort of quantitative measure. the data has to be used in compensation and dismissal discussions and decisions, and this applies to both traditional and charter teachers. So every public school teacher, traditional or charter, in Louisiana had to have a multiple measure evaluation system. I have some co-authored work with Julie Marsh from USC, who's done some looking at what's going on in Louisiana from the MMES system. And we showed this was kind of randomly done. So different schools could do it in different ways. Different districts could do it in different ways. And there is not a lot of rhyme or reason. It doesn't look like traditional public schools really implemented it any differently than charter schools did in Louisiana, that we can tell from the small sample of, I think, 10 school sites that she visited. But this was a staged process, and I'll walk you through that. Then tenure reform was implemented in Act 1 in 2012. This was an all of a sudden, July 2012, not a lot of forewarning, kind of happening over a couple of months. The legislature enacted Act 1. And this basically eliminated traditional tenure completely in Louisiana. So it meant that you could be dismissed for performance at almost any point in your career. So technically what happened was they said, okay, from now on, you only get tenure if you have a highly effective rating on this new multiple measure evaluation system for 5 out of 6 consecutive years. If you had tenure already and you're grandfathered in, or you gain tenure through this very difficult system, and then you lose it from being rated ineffective at all for 1 year, you have to then get highly effective for 5 out of 6 years again in order to receive tenure. What that meant is that very few people had real job security in Louisiana after this point in time. I should say that Codell and Betts have a nice paper where they sort of simulate some of these multiple measure evaluation systems to show how many people should be getting highly effective in each year. And basically we calculated using their parameters that there's like a 5% chance of getting highly effective if you take the data from Louisiana. There's about a 5% chance of getting highly effective 5 out of 6 years in a row. So it's hard to get tenure. Okay. Okay, so here's the timeline. I'm really proud of this because I made this pretty picture. Okay, so the top is tenure reform. The bottom is evaluation reform. So I want to kind of show this because one thing that we're going to talk about is, can we actually isolate tenure reform, or are we talking about the package of policies, tenure reform and evaluation reform together? Now, I'm actually not that concerned from a policy perspective because every single state that's passed substantial tenure reform has done so in conjunction with evaluation reform. So it might be this package of reforms that we're saying this is what lessens job security. But we also want to see if there's something just about removal of tenure, right? So we're trying to isolate both, but it's kind of if I can't, I'm not worried too much about it. But let's see if I can convince you. So in Act 54 was passed in summer of 2010, and spring of 2010, sorry. And this was just basically saying you have to do this, okay? So they don't have a program in place. They've given the parameters. They said you've got to figure it out. And so you could think that a teacher in Louisiana might say, this is coming, and I'm nervous, and I don't want to be a teacher anymore, right? This is not what I signed up for. So in this school year, in the 2010-11 school year, they designed Compass, right? They had this statewide task force. They designed the Compass system, which ended up being kind of local, like local districts and schools could sort of do what they wanted within the reason. And then they piloted it in a very, very, very small number of schools and districts in the next 2011-12 school year. So in these 2 years, there's absolutely no data, and there's actually no set policy in place. They're designing it and piloting it, right? With the assumption they're going to redo it kind of after that when they've learned from the pilot. So no teachers are affected by any kind of high-stakes measures in these 2 years. Then in the 2012-13 school year, Compass is implemented. So teachers have to be evaluated by this multi-measure evaluation system, and they need to get the high-stakes ratings. But because half of it's based on some kind of quantitative measure of student progress for every teacher, they don't get that data back in time to quit before the next fall, right? So we see them again in the fall of 2013 because they haven't gotten the principals haven't gotten the data back yet. They get the data back sometime, we think about late fall 2013 that year in Louisiana, and then they have data, but so they could basically leave for the first time based on either getting fired or exiting because they are afraid that they got low scores and they're not going to get tenure, or they are going to lose tenure. So this might be the first time they have data available. So in that summer of 2014 should be the first time we see actual high stakes reasons for leaving from the evaluation system. Does that make sense? Okay. Tenure was cut and dry. They put Act 1 into place in summer 2012 immediately. So starting in the 12-13 school year, tenure was this new reform tenure with 5 out of 6 years of highly effective. Okay. So theoretically, we should see the first sort of exits happen in summer 2012. That might happen because of the tenure reform, but there's still no actual high stakes accountability happening. Okay? So we're not really sure what performance the districts were using to make tenure decisions at that point. But in this year, they could start to use tenure decisions, right? The data for tenure decisions for the next 2 years. So we're going to say, in these 2 years, the 2011-12 summer, the summer 2012 and summer 2013, teachers could theoretically leave based on the tenure policy, but they wouldn't have any high stakes accountability policy yet that's binding on them. Now, if we catch something about evaluation, that'll be captured here in the 2012 number as well, about these first 2 years of evaluation. Okay. Yeah.
So implicit in the argument about the compass actually eliminating tenure is the fact that a lot of teachers wouldn't be highly rated on the new system, which
Right.
kind of goes against a lot of the literature that shows that everybody gets highly effective ratings. So
Yeah. So in Louisiana, it looked like about 20% got highly effective in a given year. It's a 5-level system. Most people got effective. But to get tenure, you had to get highly effective for 5 out of 6 years. And that's where we get our 5% chance of getting highly effective for 5 out of 6 years. And so like the Kraft and Gilmore papers I think you're talking about, they look at pass or not pass. They don't actually look at the highly effective rating. And if you look at the details in most of these systems, to get like at the tail is actually quite hard. But to get above passing is very easy still. Okay. So here's the data we use. I should say that all these data come from the Educational Research Alliance of New Orleans. I did not have to clean a single piece of data, which made me really, really happy. Neither did my RAs. So this was great. Nate has been amazing with the data. And this has all been funded, I should have said earlier, by the Arnold Foundation. So we really appreciate they've given us a lot of bandwidth to just sort of do the cool studies that we're interested in doing. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about this, how do you distinguish just, okay, so they have this tenure reform, and there's a lot of press about how bad teachers are, and we have to get rid of them, and, you know, that kind of, it's no fun to be a teacher here because everybody hates us, versus actually, like, do they actually care that they're being,
Right.
got this tenure?
So we're going to use a SIT study. So most of those teachers should have been affected in both groups by this kind of, it sucks to be a teacher now, accountability framework, but only some should have been differentially affected by tenure. So see if you believe it when I present it. Okay. So we're going to do an ITS first to get like a general feeling of the trend, and then we'll do the SITs to see if we can believe our ITS. Okay. See, this is when you present for your advisor, and this feels like a dissertation defense to me. Okay. Okay, so 8-year panel of teacher data. We have 6 years pre the tenure reform, 2 years post. We have about 407,000 teacher year observations from about 77,000 teachers and about 1,600 schools. I always love when I do this because I work in LA, Los Angeles, not Louisiana most of the time, and we have 1,000 schools in Los Angeles, and so I always kind of think about that as like, wow, this is like a big district kind of. Includes data on all teachers in both traditional and charter schools in Louisiana, including demographics, teaching certificates, college degrees, school assignments, and district hire dates. We look at teachers as they move across schools within the state. We cannot see them if they leave the state. And we can see them if they go into the administrator capacity, but we cannot see them if they go to private schools. So what we're going to measure is if they leave teaching in a public school, traditional or charter in Louisiana. We have school-level measures that we aggregate up from our administrative data. So demographics, school performance scores. I should say the school performance scores are what schools are held accountable for, and we norm them within a year, and we have charter identifiers. So I kind of explained how we do exit. So we look at exit in the summer after. So we have data through 14-15, but we want to see where teachers end up in 14-15, so we call it a 13-14, but we want to see where they end up, so we call it a summer 2013 exit. We have data on exits from summer 2006 to 2013. We do not have a good measure of teacher experience, which is a real bummer for us because this is the critical measure for us. So we do this in a couple ways to make teacher experience variables. So we have their salary level. We have detailed information on how much every single teacher makes in every single year in Louisiana, both on their base salary, which is dictated by our salary schedule in any traditional public school, And we have their experience level, so we have their education level in detail. And we also have their bonus kind of extra compensation. We take that out, and so we say, okay, we have then collected every single district salary schedule for every single year in our data set, and we can look at the salary level for each teacher and the education level and back out the experience for any teacher in a school that has a salary schedule in our data. We can do this for 92% of teachers. So do you guys all know what a salary schedule looks like? Okay. So if I have all these things, Nate did an amazing job of this data set and collecting, and we had all these RAs collecting all these salary schedules for years and years, and we got 92% of our teachers covered this way. Then we also have a measure of hire date. So we know for about 88% of teachers the year that they were hired in Louisiana, okay? We also know the year they graduated from their preparation program. So we can sort of look at the hire date and the preparation date and try to get to the experience level of these teachers. But there was this thing about a hurricane in Louisiana that happened, and a lot of the state data was kind of very strongly harmed at that point. And so we have a heavy underreporting of experience from the data of the teachers that came in before the hurricane. And so this is not missing at random. So we can't just use our hire date-based measures. I should say neither is this missing at random because charter schools are less likely to have published salary schedules. But we do have, for 80% of the 92% of teachers that we have salary-based measures for, we also have the hire date measure, and they are almost exactly the same. So we feel very confident that this measure gets us to what we need. And so we use that for these 92%, and then we fill in with the 7% of the hire date measures, and we're missing about 1.3% of teachers. These teachers look very similar to our other teachers on observables other than experience. Okay, so here's my first strategy. So this is just a simple interrupted time series. We do this by linear probability models, and we just look to see if a teacher exited the state in a given summer or stayed in the state in a given summer. We don't care if they moved schools or moved districts. We have our time trend of year, which we center at 0 in the final year before the Act 1. We have our indicator. So we follow the Bloom and Jacob and Zhu and Summers model that they suggest instead of doing a trend in the post years, we put 2 indicators in for each year. So alpha 1 and alpha 2 tell us the deviation from the pre-trend in each 2012 and 2013. And then so we run this for the ITS looking at the post-tenure reform, and we also do this with 4 years of post-trend, of post-data to look and see if it's recapturing a year of Compass, right? So we do for the Compass years, 2010, 2011, and then also the Compass plus tenure years, 2012 and 2013. So here's what it looks like. This is just descriptive. This is not adjusted. This is not the ITS. This is just the descriptive data. And you can see what looks like maybe a slight uptick here in 2010, but on average, the mean is about 6.6% of teachers exit before the tenure reform, and then 9.4% of teachers exit post-tenure reform. And here's what it looks like in the ITS. So you can see that this looks like it's really coming straight from the tenure reform. And we model it, and we actually find that there seems to be a small uptick in the years, especially in 2011, for the Compass reform, but that there's still about a 2% in each year post-tenure reform increase in attrition. And to Susanna's point, we don't know if this is happening because districts are letting go of teachers or if it's happening because teachers are exiting voluntarily. It's a great question. Not in this period. There was in some of the pre-trend period. And again, that's part of where we come to the SITs to make sure that because all teachers have been affected by that. The other thing happening here is Common Core came into place right around this time and was being phased in Louisiana. And so that's why this is kind of just descriptive data, right? We just don't trust this as causal because they could be responding to rifts and layoffs that have been happening from the recession. They could be responding to the Common Core, and teachers maybe didn't like that, and they could be responding to evaluation or this kind of anti-teacher sentiment that we've been hearing about all over the country. So then we go to the SITs. So we want to know, again, now the impact. Again, we don't have a control group, right? We don't have another state that we feel like we could just compare this to. So we do this in 3 ways so that we can try to see if we can really come to believe our ITS measures. And so three control groups, three comparison groups. The first is traditional public school teachers covered by the state law versus the charter school teachers. And so we call the responder group the group that we think should have reacted to the tenure reform. Both of these sets of teachers, were impacted by the evaluation reform, but only the traditional public school teachers were impacted by the tenure reform. And so you think if teachers value tenure as a part of their compensation, right, as job security, but charter school teachers never factored tenure into their compensation because they never had it, so they don't have to lose it, right? That's our first comparison. It's not an awesome comparison. It seems like the cleanest one, and then you sort of think about it. Well, these teachers look very different from each other, right? These labor markets are quite different. So that's one reason. Second reason is there's reason to think that all these sort of teacher reforms, especially one that reduces job security for traditional market teachers, that actually might cause attrition between these two markets, right? Because now the protections that they had aren't there anymore, and they're more like charter schools. And so if I was working in a traditional public school because I wanted those protections, and I don't have it anymore, I might be more willing to go to a charter school, right, and vice versa. And so we're just not sure if there's some mess happening here. And so this is our first cut, but it's not our best cut. Okay, so then we move to the next cut. So this is teachers who just had tenure. They had just gotten tenure the year that tenure is removed, right? So there you can say, this is my present value of job security, and I'm losing tenure. These guys never actually had it. So if they discounted it at all because they had never quite gotten it at all, right? They were going to get it. It was a future benefit, but it's less valuable to them because it was not a current benefit. Then they should react less than the fourth-year teachers. But they should be very similar in other ways, right? These are fourth-year teachers versus third-year teachers, and we see that in the data. The last comparison is teachers who are fully retirement eligible. So in Louisiana, at 25 years of experience, you immediately get almost your full salary in retirement benefits. So you have a certain alternative income, right, that you know you have without any insecurity. You're not going to get fired from it, right? 10 to 19-year teachers didn't have any retirement eligibility. So we use this as the control group. They still need their job. They don't have a certain alternative income. They don't have retirement coming to them. Okay, so it's a straight SITS model coming out of the ITS where we, again, just look at the 2012 and 2013 years separately. So year one of the reform, year two of the reform. Responder groups for each of those three comparisons, so we'll run them separately. And so we're mostly concerned in beta 1 and beta 2, which tell us the kind of deviation from the pre-trend for the responders relative to the non-responders. Okay. And then, because I was trained by Susanna and Sean, you have to run all sorts of falsification analyses. And so whenever my students get mad at me for making them run everything, I blame her immediately. And this is what we run. We run a pre-intervention year dip, right? So we say, what happens if we make the intervention happen in the year before tenure? Do we see the same effects? And if we do, we have a problem, right? Because that shouldn't be because of tenure. We then run a bunch of auxiliary regressions to kind of look at outcomes that shouldn't be affected by the tenure reform. So if we see that third and fourth year teachers respond differently to the tenure reform in terms of things like proportion of white students in their school or the school enrollment that they should have no control over, we have a problem. We use charter school teachers in the same experience groups. So we say, okay, third and fourth year charter teachers instead of third and fourth year traditional public school teachers. And then we also use alternative experience groups separated by the same amount. So we say instead of third and fourth year teachers, which should have a difference, fourth and fifth year teachers both lost tenure. So they shouldn't see a difference. The last thing we do is similar, but we call it a kind of a dosage test. Because if you noticed, which I skipped over quickly, 25 plus year teachers are probably different than 10 to 19 year teachers. And so that parallel isn't awesome. But there's this middle group of 20 to 24 year teachers who are partially retirement eligible, right? They get some drawdown, but there's a steep cut at 25 years. So these guys should be more effective at tenure reform than the 10 to 19 year teachers, but less impacted by the reform than the 25 plus year teachers. And so we should see a greater effect of tenure reform on 25 plus than 2024 and 2024 than on 10 to 19. I feel like I'm going really fast and there are no questions. Chris.
Why, as you suspect that third-year teachers might also respond, just
We tried second and third year teachers.
Second.
Yeah, same thing. But the idea isn't, I mean, yes, they should respond, but they should respond less, right? And so that's the whole thing. We actually, you'll see that they do respond, but they respond less.
Can I follow up on that one?
Yeah.
I think it's worth acknowledging maybe that given that they may respond less but still respond somewhat, maybe as the effect on this, isn't the average treatment effect
Yep,
they would have in mind, and I guess would be a lower bound,
yep,
where they might think of as the full effect.
yep. So that's why we start with the ITS to sort of see if we get some effect, and then we say, okay, now we've got all these comparisons. These should all be lower bounds, right? These should all be differential effects. All teachers are impacted, but these ones should be impacted more. It's a nice point. I don't think I make enough in the paper, so thank you. Okay, so this is the first results from the first sits. So we do find that tenure reform impacted TPS teachers, or traditional public school teachers, more than the charter school teachers, as we would have expected. Here's our base model. I'm not sure these highlights came out great, but you do see that there's about a 3% in each of the 2 years increase in attrition for traditional public school teachers relative to charter teachers in the post years. So then we start testing it, and the one that we care about here is this pre-year effect, and we see nothing. Then these are our auxiliary regressions. Again, we don't want to see anything significant here, because if so, then it means that traditional public school teachers and charter school teachers reacted differently to tenure reform in terms of the schools that they were in terms of enrollment and percent white. And again, we don't see anything here. I did want to highlight that top yellow row there. It does show that traditional public school teachers they're in different schools, right, than charter school teachers. So traditional public schools are larger and are more white in Louisiana than charter schools. Charter schools serve a very black, low-income population. Okay, so then we look and see these third versus fourth year teachers. And we do find the tenure reform impacted these newly tenured teachers more than these not yet tenured teachers. So again, here's our base regression. In the year of the tenure reform, we see about a 2.5% percentage point increase in attrition for the fourth year teachers relative to the third year teachers. In the third year teachers in the second year have about a 4 percentage point increase in attrition, as do, right? And there's no difference for the fourth year teachers. Well, that makes sense because they become fourth year teachers in the second year of the reform. So they would have had it, right? And then here are our spec checks. We don't see anything in the pre-year. And we don't see anything in the auxiliary regressions. Okay, so now is what we do. We say charter school teachers that are third and fourth year. So they were out of our last regression. Now they're in there, and these are just charter schools, so the ends are really small. And you can see that we don't see anything for charter school teachers. Now, one thing that we note is that these are really big coefficients. They're just not significant because there's just a lot of noise. So we're still trying to figure out what to make of that, and if anyone has ideas, we'd love it. My sort of initial thought is that we're seeing kind of movements happen anyway on these teachers, and so there's just but we're still trying to suss out why we see these sort of large coefficients here. Ideas welcome. It's a good question. Pre-trend, yes. So in the post-Katrina years, I should have said also, charter schools are very highly located in New Orleans, more than most other districts. So that's another issue. So in the post-Katrina years, yeah, because New Orleans went almost entirely charter. But the district started the state started regulating the charter schools with pretty heavy oversight in about 2008, 9. And so you started to see a kind of charter schools were closing and other ones were opening, but they were closing the poor performers. So no, not after that period. Some, but not as much as the pre. And then here's when we look at fourth versus fifth year teachers. We don't see anything significant. The same thing for second versus third year teachers. We don't report it. And then, okay. So this is 2 of our 3 comparison groups seem to show our hypothesis was what we would have predicted. Okay, so now our last group is this retirement eligible teachers versus ineligible teachers. You see in the first year that the retirement eligible teachers were 2.5 percentage points more likely than the retirement ineligible teachers, who were still already by themselves 1.2 percentage points more likely to exit relative to the pre-trend. And in 2013, they're still 1.5 percentage points more likely, as were the non-tenure eligible, the non-retirement eligible teachers. So everyone's getting more likely to leave, but that's especially so for the retirement eligible teachers. And then we don't see anything in the pre-year. We don't see anything in the auxiliary regressions. And then, so here's our dosage test. So here we have in column 5 the full versus partial. So these are the 25 plus years are the responders, and the 20 to 24 years are the partially eligible teachers. So they're going to get something if they leave. And we see about everyone's going to be more likely to leave, but these guys are 2 percentage points still more likely to leave than the partially eligible teachers. These guys are waiting, right, because they're about to be able to retire fully. In the second year, we see everyone's more likely to leave, but there's no difference between the fully eligible and partially. That's partly because some of those teachers became fully eligible, I think. And then here we have the partial eligibility, and it flips, nothing in the first year, but there's a significant impact in the second year. And then we have charter teachers, and we don't see anything. We still have relatively big point estimates, so we're still trying to figure out what's happening with this group. I'm flying through. I've never given it. Okay. So many, many, many models. The big takeaway here is it looks like the removal of tenure did lead to an increase in teacher exit right after implementation in the first 2 years, and that there seem to be larger jumps in the exit rate for teachers who have more to lose, right, in terms of their overall compensation. When we did the kind of back of the envelope calculations, it looks like they lost about 3 to 3.5% more teachers in the years after tenure reform than they would have otherwise, which is about 1,700 to 2,000 teachers, or 1,500 to 7,000 teachers. So it's a big proportion relative, right? So we see more newly tenured teachers leave versus the not yet tenured teachers. We see more retirement eligible teachers leave than those who were not, so they had a certain alternative income. And then we see more TPS versus charter school teachers leave, although we're still kind of fuzzy on this result. We did test this for other groups. So we said, well, this should also apply for people who have better alternative market options. So maybe you have an engineering degree, or you have a math degree, or you have a science degree of some sort, or you're teaching a special ed class, right? So you can go elsewhere much easier than traditional elementary school teachers. We don't find anything for those teachers. But there are some limitations here. So first of all, we're not totally sure we convinced ourselves that we disaggregate these two reforms, right? So we still, I think, we're picking up something about tenure plus evaluation. We don't actually care, right? This is the package of reforms that's being implemented everywhere. So we're just going to call it that we think we're trying to get it, but if we don't, this is still important policy for policy reasons. And we think what we're reporting as a tenure effect, we still net out that pre-trend that includes the compass years. And so we might actually be underreporting what happens with this full package of reforms. Like I talked a lot about the charter schools, maybe inappropriate, so we don't rely solely on them. We had one reviewer that was like, drop everyone else and just use the charter schools, and this is why we don't. We just don't feel great about this particular. And then we don't have effectiveness data. This goes back to your original point. We don't know who's leaving, and so maybe this is great, right? It may be that you wanted to lose those 1,700 teachers from Louisiana. Those could be the teachers who aren't going to perform well and are going to harm children or not help them. We don't have this. We're supposed to get the links between students and teachers this year, and we'll be able to do that. And we'll be able to do longer periods post. So what we think might be happening is kind of an immediate shock of the reform, but then people self-regulate, right? Then you sort of say, well, now I'm going to take this into my compensation calculation, and I'm going to still compare this to my other options. This still looks pretty good for me. I'm going to do it. So this might be a one-time loss, or a one-time 2-year, 3-year loss, and then you go back. So we're going to be able to look at that a little bit better. But we think that even if it's just a 2-year or 3-year situation, there's probably still really important implications. So when I think about what happens when you suddenly need more teachers and you didn't plan for it, I think about California. And I think about, we had a class size reduction law, and suddenly we needed a lot of new teachers. And we tenured them, and they maybe weren't as good as they should have been. And we got this whole influx of teachers into our system, and we were not prepared for what to do, right? So if you don't prepare for this, if you put in tenure reform and you don't think about what's going to happen to the teachers who might, even if it's a short-term leave, right, a quick 2,000 teachers leave in a given year, you better be ready to replace them with equally good or better teachers, right? And you can predict this, right? So you could probably predict which kinds of teachers will leave and think about how you're going to make sure you keep those teachers. And you could pay them more, right? You could make up the compensation for them, whether it's monetary or otherwise. It could be working conditions, right? And one thing we think a lot about is some of these more senior teachers, they may be important mentors in the schools, right? They may be really important teachers that maybe not the ones that you necessarily want to lose. If you're going to push the people who are staying because they love teaching, they could retire, but they don't want to yet, and they're staying, and then maybe you're losing them, right? We just don't know if they're good teachers or not, but they might even have institutional knowledge about the schools. So you should be careful about who you're losing in these situations. Yeah. Yeah, well, we don't know, so that's unfortunate, and we did not do the qualitative work on this, although I would have liked to. But there's a couple ways to think about it. One is they're very expensive. So either the districts might choose to let them go because they're very expensive, which is the concern that you have and why you put in tenure policies, right? Or they could assume that they're going to be let go because they're expensive and they could leave. Or they might think, I'm not that good, right? So we do know there's a U-shaped return, right, in terms of productivity. The end of their experience, maybe they're not awesome teachers and they are worried they're not going to get highly effective ratings the next year and they will be fired. So they decide to leave.
So they wouldn't be fired for not getting effective.
You can be. Once you don't have tenure, you can be fired at will.
You can be, but who's going to fire someone who gets an effective rating? Did they,
We don't know. We're hoping to get that data. So we've been trying to get the actual Compass ratings from the state. We only have them at the aggregate level right now, at the school level. We're not sure we can get those, but we can get the VAMs, which tend to be correlated to some extent. And so we're hoping to be able to look and say, are we losing teachers who were in the middle of the distribution, right, or who weren't being scored highly? But it's still a noisy measure because it's going to be a 0.3 correlation, right? It's not going to be everything.
it would be nice to think kind of for these groups. I really like the way you've done all this comparison, but why would they leave? I mean, is it that there's this atmosphere they don't like, that they now have to worry about things they didn't want to worry about, and that's just like this worry that makes them leave? Is it they're being pushed out? Because it might give you some leverage too on things like, well, would they move to schools where they're really unlikely to leave? So there would
Right.
be some transfer going on.
That's, yeah, one of our next steps is to look at transfer to help get at that. But I think it's a nice point, and probably haven't given enough thought to other than the kind of compensation aspect of it, of why would I put up with this? I could retire, I have my full salary, and I don't have to worry about getting fired next year. But I think it's nice to think about the mechanisms a little bit more. The original paper, we had this whole we derived the whole utility function. And it was overkill because it's just compensation in the end. But you're right that we could think about other reasons that aren't just about that. Next to Susanna.
I'm wondering whether the union's responsibility is in a way made up for that lost compensation or felt part of the compensation package.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Louisiana is a right-to-work state. Most districts do have a union, whether or not they are called a union or an association, but they all have salary schedules that have been bargained, so there's something there. We don't have those contracts in Louisiana, but I will, in the last slide, I'll talk about some of the other work I've got going on with similar reforms in the country, and we are looking at the impact of these reforms on the CBAs to understand if the CBAs are changing in reaction to these kinds of policies. Because I think that's, if you know my work at all, that's what I care about, and that's what I study the most, and so I think it's a great point. In terms of, the teachers union is not strong in Louisiana in the way that it is strong in California. And so we don't, the likelihood of there being a state push about this, it didn't work, right? The law was passed. I saw another hand, yeah.
So I'm a little confused about if part of the, if this is considered part of their compensation, we know that some teachers have other higher compensation opportunities if they have a STEM degree and they have special ed. I'm confused why you didn't find anything. Do you have any ideas about why there wasn't any differentiation there?
Yeah. Couple ideas. We thought we would, so we were surprised too. One is that most contracts don't differentiate in terms of compensation for higher pay, for different degrees, right? So most of these teachers weren't getting paid differently for having a science or math degree to begin with, and they're not going to get paid differently in other districts now, right? So where are they going to, or in other states now? So are they going to move out of the state and be a teacher in science? You got to go to the private schools or the charter schools, and there's probably not enough of them to absorb them all, right? So it might just be that the movement isn't big enough to catch. The alternative career one is one that we've thought about a lot, and what we cannot do in this paper is look at the recruitment pipeline. So what I would expect to see happen is that some of those teachers just might not go into teaching, right? And we don't see that. We can't see that here. We're hoping to get that data as well, but I'm less optimistic.
I know in some states that you teach science, but you still have an ed school degree, right? So I wonder how many of these science teachers actually have science degrees that are portable to another job market.
Yeah. You'd have to, I can't remember.
So, I mean, how many high schools, middle schools versus elementary schools?
I have to look, but it's the same split as in most states because this is the full state sample.
Okay.
I have to ask Nate. I can't remember. I know we have their credential. I can't remember if we also have their major. I just can't remember.
Because that could be another reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
This might be kind of a wild here, but where I'm from in Louisiana, job market's driven more by the price of oil.
Interesting.
You have like a real kind of shift or kind of time period you're looking at. And I think if anything, the bias would be helping in terms of time. But it might be worth thinking about whether that's a contributor to declining in certain geographic areas.
So the price of oil is differentially important in the parts that have.
Yeah, like so right now, I mean, the jobs are so hard to come by, and people aren't going to keep a job they have just because it'll change climate quickly up.
So on the ITS, it would help us, but it shouldn't differentially affect like a third or fourth year teacher, right? Yeah.
I would think that there's just going to be a change in the commercial.
Right. The market isn't great outside. So it could be worse elsewhere is what you're saying. Yeah. That's a good point. I think we can look at least like an economy. We can look at some sort of measure of the economy in each of the districts. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. I think it's also just important to point this out. Even if we're losing average teachers, right, or not good teachers and we're not replacing them with good teachers, teacher turnover by itself is not great for kids and schools, right? So you want to think about that as a whole. And then there's just some estimates, and I'm not sure where they got them exactly, but it's depending on the location, between $5,000 and $18,000 to recruit a new teacher. And so could be very expensive. That being said, it's probably counterbalanced by the fact that you're losing some of the high salary teachers. And so we're not sure what it does to district budgets, and we don't have those data. And also the teacher pension system. I mean, suddenly if you're losing 3% of your retirement eligible teachers that you weren't expecting to lose, what happens to your pension system, which are usually not funded to expect those kinds of shocks. So we think that you should think about compensation for, how to, basically if you're gonna do this, there may be good reasons to remove tenure, but we want states to think about it before they just do it, right? What we don't want to see is all the teachers leave, the harmful things about it, and them not be ready to retain the teachers they want to keep. Okay, so where do we go from here? So we think there's a lot of questions left to answer. There's some kind of mixed methods questions that we haven't gone into yet, but we're hoping to think about that in other states that we're working in. So I'll start with the Louisiana districts, the Louisiana studies. So all these papers are with Jane and Nate. We're looking at the longer-term impacts of the reform, so we'll have more years of data. And we're looking forward to kind of getting the third and fourth years out of the reform. we're hoping to get the VAM data so we can look at the quality of the workforce and what's happening. And we're thinking we're going to also look at how this reform impacts teachers' salaries, right? So what you should see is in the out years, districts are adjusting, and they're raising salaries for some teachers or for all teachers to adjust for the loss. So we'll see if that's impacting the salaries of the teachers in either the base salaries or the supplemental salaries of teachers in these districts. I've also got a nice project also funded by Arnold and a couple other foundations with Josh Cowan and Eric Bruner that's looking at this happening in Michigan and California as well. And so in Michigan, we look at the shift from traditional employment protections to performance-based protection. So they put the evaluation system in, and they also put in, they also removed collective bargaining rights, mandatory collective bargaining in Michigan. And so they used to have to bargain with the union, and now it's optional. And so you have to it's a right to work state now, which is a pretty big reform. And so we're looking to see what happens to the teacher labor market with these shifts. And we can also look at the pipeline that's coming in, as well as the teachers who are already in the system in the whole state of Michigan. So we're looking at kind of the same analyses, and then we're also looking at what happens with this charter school versus traditional public school crossover. Are we seeing some of these some of the protections are gone now from traditional schools? They look more like charter schools and some of the protections. So do you see the kind of labor market liberalized in some ways? You see these people are crossing over more liberally. They don't need to be in a traditional public school anymore. We had this great idea to do in California with Vergara, but it never happened. So now it's kind of a threat of tenure reform, right? And we actually think this does seem from the aggregate data in California to be we may see something there. I should say we also see in Michigan from our preliminary analysis that the same patterns hold up as in Louisiana. Then with these same two plus Dan Goldhaber, we are collecting all the contracts from these states. So in California, this is going to be my fifth round of contracts covering over a decade of CBAs in California, and we'll have a long panel that covers from pre-recession through the recession, and then also to the threat from Vergara and after. So we'll be able to know sort of what happens to the CBAs. Do they change with this kinds of state-level threats? In Michigan, we're going to have the CBAs directly pre the right to work change and the post right to work change. And so we'll be able to see how the CBAs, to your question, how the local contracts, the local unions are negotiating with their districts in response to these kind of state policy reforms, teacher policy reforms. And we'll have Washington in a pre-post time period as well, kind of as a control. They didn't really have a lot of reform happen there or much threat.
Do you know what proportion of Michigan districts chose not to bargain?
So the teachers don't have to join. Right, that's a right to work state. So they all can bargain, but the teachers don't have to join the union. So there's a free riding, right? This is the whole right to work problem. And so we don't know yet. We're hoping to get those numbers in Michigan.
So this is right to work, but not necessarily no good.
Right.
They still have to be working.
But they can bargain over much less. So they can't bargain over salary and a number of other really important. I think that's right. We'll have to check with Josh. But yeah, a number of very important evaluation can't be bargained anymore at the local level. I'll check with that. But I'm pretty sure, I'll look. But there's like 6 things that they cannot collectively bargain over that used to be bargainable and that are important factors for working conditions. And so what you can bargain over as a union is really diminished. And it's really interesting. So we've collected all these, well, the Mackinac Foundation, or Institute, collected all these pre-post contracts, and we've got an army of RAs, as you can imagine, coding 1,000 Michigan contracts right now. And we're seeing some really interesting sort of early signs of what's happening in these CBAs. Things like they'll keep the exact same, a number of districts have kept the exact same language in the CBAs and just put a line at the bottom that says does not apply to teachers in the teacher bargaining agreement. So, it's going to be interesting to see actually how we think that might mean that they're not translating the state policy to the district policy, right? So we're looking forward to the results from that. We'll have some preliminary work, hopefully at AAFP on this. Okay, so that's all I got. Yeah?
I have 2 quite different questions.
2 quite different answers.
Historical context for tenure, I thought, I may be wrong, college level and then down to high school. Historically, it was to protect teachers from, having a political disagreement with the principal of the school board and getting fired for that.
Yep.
And then it sounds like it morphed into, that concern apparently faded, and then it was still around and morphed into being part of compensation or job security. Is that true?
we don't know, right? So we think about it as compensation. Part of the compensation is not having the risk of being fired for these arbitrary reasons of disagreeing with the principal, and the principal fires you because he doesn't like you, right? Or she doesn't like you. So we kind of factor that into the compensation conversation, but we don't know if there's an increase in the incidence of arbitrary firings resulting from the removal of tenure. We don't have, so this again, it would be nice to have qualitative work. I'm not sure I could get a principal to admit on record that she fired someone because she didn't like them in a post-tenure world, but it would be great if we could find that out.
The second question is, you just may be aware of this, right? The most recent of many headlines in California is we have a teacher shortage already, definitely, LA Times. Are you aware policymakers are thinking about that problem being made worse by tenure reform in California?
My sense is that the policymakers are very worried about the teacher shortage. And Suzanne, I think you could say what you think. I mean, whenever I'm up in Sacramento, this is all that I hear. When I work with districts, this is all that I hear. I don't know the extent to which the teacher shortage is the size that it's reported to be. I think that there's definitely a teacher shortage in some areas. When you talk to districts and they get down into it, they're still having a hard time hiring special ed teachers, some math and science high school teachers. They're not having that hard of a time hiring elementary teachers who'll teach in a traditional school, right? There's some hard to staff schools that are hard to staff. So again, I think this has been a problem that people are talking about in California, and it's a reason people are giving for not having evaluation reform, not having tenure reform, not having a lot of teacher policy reform. I don't know the degree to which it's accurate. Do you have a better idea of?
No, it's a hard thing to measure. There are supposedly big increases in turnover, at least in districts.
Yeah.
So, since you in your I think you mentioned it, did you say you're going to look at the people coming in, if that changed pre and post tenure?
In Michigan, we can look at it. We just can't look at it in Louisiana at this point. So we have we'll have a different data set in Michigan that's got some of the transcript data from the high school students who choose to become teachers. And so that'll be really exciting when that fills out. But we don't have that in Louisiana.
You don't have like teacher certification test scores or anything?
Not from the state, no. So we can drink early, is that what I'm saying? Or no?
Enter public health, so encouragability of latitude. But so my understanding was that the tenure policies are essentially a quality improvement. Like the point of changing the tenure policy in Louisiana was to improve the quality of education.
Right. So the idea, right, is that if I run a business and I hire everybody, and then before I have a chance to actually understand if they're good, I can't fire them anymore, then that's the idea, right? And so if we only give teachers a few years and then we can't tell if they're good or not, and they get a job for life is the way they talk about it, even though it's not quite true. Right, so then you'll be able to improve the teacher workforce because you have more latitude to manage it.
And so are there any changes in quality?
Right, so we don't have those outcomes yet in Louisiana, so we are hoping to get those this year, and we'll be able to tell you that in about 6 months, maybe a year. Yeah. But in Susanna's work in New York, we do see some change in teacher quality, where. Mm-hmm.
What about the quality of students? Not the quality of the individual students, but the quality of their education.
The outcomes.
Well, that's the hope, is that it's related to that, because it's kind of what you're estimating is how much teachers contribute to the learning of the kids. And so you're seeing whether you're getting rid of the teachers who are putting the kids together on that list. And then in DC, you have interesting.
Yeah.
DC, New York, I think it's a little more questionable about whether it's benefit, but in DC, it looked like it was.
With.
We have a paper on this coming out from EPA that looks at heterogeneous effects of teacher turnover. Teachers who leave who are effective and just go organically versus teachers who went through some type of dismissal criteria, performance review. And when they leave a school grade cohort when replaced with a teacher who's really effective, you see a dramatic growth
Right.
in the achievement of the students in that school grade cohort when ineffective teachers left.
Right.
So it's not just getting rid of a low-performing teacher, it's also the critical question of with whom can you replace them.
Right, and there's a lot of competition for us in a district like DC or Los Angeles where you have a market for teachers. I mean, it's an attractive place for teachers. It might be easier to replace a teacher who's low quality with someone who's high quality. In a whole state, you don't know that you have that same ability to recruit the best teachers to replace these ones. So there's a kind of a equilibrium effect.
Did you look just at New Orleans?
We did not, because it's mostly charter school. So there's very few traditional public schools left in New Orleans. It would have been a small. Yeah, it's still very low now. I mean, it's just switching over now. Yeah. Which is interesting. We have other work in New Orleans looking at how teachers are paid, right? Because this is the first time you have a whole district that's basically charter. We find that charters pay teachers very similarly to traditional public schools, with a couple of very interesting differences. Like charter schools seem to pay more. Schools in New Orleans seem to pay more for if you work with sort of more white kids. There's very few white kids in the district, and so this is something about attracting the best teachers for the parents who go into these sort of selective schools who seem to be higher white proportions. And then we see teachers get paid a little bit more based on their school performance. We don't have, again, the individual exams, but we have the way that the schools do. And so in higher performing schools, teachers get paid a little bit more. That's the big differences. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very descriptive paper.
Do you have a sense of, so like, when I think probably most people in this room, like their main experience with tenure is going to be higher education. Like, what are the biggest differences? So I guess one question I had specifically was, like, is there any evidence of like a teacher being awarded tenure in one district and then another district kind of like recruit sort of like experienced teachers and offering like teachers tenure as they enter?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So I know the California contract's the best, so that's what it would be in. So most districts in California, you can get your salary over. So if I'm a 7th-year teacher in Burbank and I want to go to Los Angeles, they can put me the 7th year on the salary schedule, but I don't get my tenure status. So you have to work in that district in some states and in that state in some states for 2 years or 3 years, whatever it is, to get the tenure. You don't get to switch it between. So yeah, so it's.
I mean, that would really incentivize you not to move.
Yes, and that is a big problem. So there's some research by Dan Goldhaber that I think he's starting about cross-state borders, right? And you would think that you would, in places where you would be able to see teachers kind of move across state borders, even if the district would take their experience, they don't take their tenure, and how much do you value it? And so he's got that work. I think he presented it at APAM, and you see what you would expect.
Does it seem like different teachers value like tenure, like sort of the heterogeneous values of tenure? Like, I guess maybe a teacher who, I don't know, just like different like characteristics, like different like credentialed teachers, or maybe like different like performing teachers value tenure differently.
Right. So the null results that I kind of talked about at the very end about credentialed teachers doesn't look like they value tenure any differently from each other. Again, so it looks like teachers with more to lose or have alternative incomes, right? They might value tenure less or more. We don't know. I mean, you could think about one thing we controlled for, but we didn't actually study in terms of differential effects would be like teachers in different kinds of schools. So maybe I value tenure more if I'm in a really tough school, and I think it's really hard. I'm working. I don't know. Right? You could paint a lot of different pictures about that. Yeah, we didn't test that, but it's interesting. You don't have to come up with questions for me.
It's an interesting topic.
I mean, I think it's interesting in California, right? Because it's been such a topic of conversation here. What do we do with the Vergara case and the aftermath of Vergara? We have a 2-year probationary period in California, which is the shortest of any state. Is it enough time? Is it even harder to deal with this in California? What would happen if we extend? We also don't pay our teachers very well, so what would happen if you upped the length of tenure, which I think a lot of us think would be a good idea in California to give people more time to develop, but then will we have to pay them more, and what would that mean? And so depends on who you ask and where they live.
Relative to other.
Yes. We could go into that because we've got a lot of stories about like teachers who live in high rent areas in the Los Angeles area, and they have to commute, and in Los Angeles, right, you got to commute an hour to get into the same district, and so there's a lot of people saying like, I just don't get paid enough to live in the neighborhood of my school, and then so what do you do? So, so big, right? So what if you remove tenure and now they lose job security too? So I think that's an issue we should think about as a state, right?
Yeah. Continue the conversation.
Great.